Hi, everyone. My name is Andrés Gannon, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. Along with Chelsea Estancona, we both run the online Peace Science Colloquium. This colloquium was started in 2015 and is a part of the annual meeting of the Peace Science Society that is designed to celebrate the excellent research that happens both before and after the annual meeting for the Peace Science Society. We now have a new website for the Peace Science Society that has just recently launched. It is now homed at the University of Georgia. And so it's peacessi.org. I'm going to go ahead and we'll have that in the notes for the session as well. But that's the new sort of website that we have for the program writ large. Our paper for today, which is the last one of the spring semester, is called Push, Not Peace, Reconsidering the Drivers of Refugee Return by Mae MacDonald, a PhD candidate in political science at Stanford University. We have two great discussants, both of whom are starting new homes in the fall. Idean Salehyan, and next fall is going to be a professor in the Department of International Affairs at the University of Georgia, leaving University of North Texas. And Perisa Davutoglu just defended her dissertation and is starting at the University of Central Florida in the fall and the Department of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. The way that today's session will go is that Mae will present for about 12-15 minutes, and then we'll have the discussants go ahead and give some feedback on the papers. Those that are in the audience are invited to leave comments or questions in the chat. And then if there's time, I'll sort of integrate comments that are in the chat into the flow of the conversation, or you all could raise your hands as well. And we'll prioritize comments by the discussant, but all of the information, the comments, questions, things put in the chat, etc., will be saved and sent to the presenter in order to maximize feedback. So we'll plan on ending at around the 10:55 or so Central Time. And so, Mae, we'll have you take it over from here.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Andres, and thanks to the Peace Science Society for hosting me today. I'm really excited to present this paper. This is the first time I presented this, so yeah, really looking forward to hearing the feedback of the discussants and anyone else in the audience. Okay, so to start this project, I want to look at two cases of refugee return. So the first case is thinking about refugees from Afghanistan that returned to Afghanistan whilst conflict was still ongoing in the 1990s. So refugees from Afghanistan were mostly hosted in Iran and Pakistan. And what happened during this decade is, even though conflict continued in Afghanistan, around 4.5 million refugees returned over this decade. Why do they return to war? This kind of doesn't make sense when we think about when we expect refugees to return. They return because of forced return policies in both Iran and Pakistan. So in Iran, the government changed refugee status so that people had temporary residence permits and then they were deported back. In Pakistan, the government and UNHCR were doing things like cutting food aid to encourage people to return. So these refugees didn't return to their home country because they wanted to return, but instead because they were forced to. The second case is more recent and might be something that you've heard about in the news over the past few years. In 2023, a civil war broke out in Sudan. Now, in Sudan, there were millions of people from South Sudan who are refugees who were living there. What happened was 3/4 of those refugees returned within 2 years. Again, why did they return? They didn't return because they wanted to return back to South Sudan, but instead they were forced to return because a war broke out in the country that they were claiming asylum in. What we saw is that refugees from South Sudan living in Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia mostly stayed. So we saw this massive refugee movement back from Sudan to South Sudan for this one country, but not for other countries that refugees were claiming asylum in. So I think that these two cases are interesting because they speak to a question in the migration literature of when do refugees return. So the conventional explanation to this question is that refugees will return when there's peace at the end of the war. So the way that the 1951 Refugee Convention, or the durable solutions outlined in the 1951 Convention suggested that refugee crises typically end when the conflict or the source of persecution that refugees are fleeing is over. So the typical way that we expect things to happen is there's a conflict, refugees will leave, they'll be protected in asylum, and then once the conflict or the source of persecution is over, they will repatriate or they will return. This kind of conventional narrative is supported by existing micro-level evidence. So studies of refugee return have traditionally looked at looking at variation within groups to understand which people from a certain country intend to return. So, for example, there have been studies of people claiming asylum in the global north, Syrian refugees claiming asylum in the global north, asking them which of the factors will encourage you to return. And the majority of this research suggests that it's origin country security that matters most. So people care more about whether their origin country is safe rather than the economic opportunities they have in asylum. So the implications of both this conventional narrative and this micro-level evidence that we have is that return should follow conflict termination and return during war should be rare. So return should mostly happen during peace and not during conflict. Using a new global data set that I'm going to discuss later in the presentation, I show that this isn't typically what we see. So there are two puzzling patterns when we look at global macro level trends in refugee return. The first is that most return actually happens while conflict in the origin country is ongoing. So approximately 3/4 of all returns occur while war is still occurring. Here is a bar plot where you can see year on year returns and whether they're returning to a country that's in no conflict, low intensity conflict, or high intensity conflict. And what you see is that most conflict happens not when there's peace, but when conflict is still ongoing in the origin country. The second puzzling pattern is that we don't often see high rates of return under peace. So this plot here shows if we think about all refugees living in asylum countries where there's peace in their origin country, what proportion return year on year, the proportion is actually pretty low, and the mean is 3.4%. So these are two quite puzzling things. If we think about what existing studies suggest, what the conventional narrative suggests, that refugees will stay in asylum whilst war is ongoing and then return when war ends, this isn't the global pattern that we see. Instead, we see that most returns happen during conflict, and then once there's peace, we don't then see high rates of return. So why has the existing literature missed these dominant patterns? Well, what I show on a plot here is that most studies of refugee return we have a lot of qualitative and normative studies, and then in the empirical side, the quantitative empirical side, we see that a lot of studies focus on return intentions. So these are people asking people, when do you intend to return, rather than actual return rates. And a lot of this has been concentrated on a few cases, predominantly Syria. So the triangles are Syria. And what this means is that we're often missing cases where refugees are returning due to conflict. We also are missing, because we're focusing mostly on intentions, we're not seeing cases where refugees are forced to return rather than them having meaningful choice to remain. Again, also with the focus being on Syria, we're missing cases in lots of other parts of the world where refugees are living in different kinds of contexts. So that's kind of to outline why the existing literature has missed these dominant global patterns. So now to get to my theory, to try to understand what is happening here. Why are we seeing these two puzzling patterns? My argument is that both of these puzzling patterns reflect the same mechanism. The large-scale returns occur often when conditions in asylum deteriorate, not when conditions at home improve. This is not to say that the ideal case, to negate the ideal case, which is that refugees will have protection in asylum and they will want to return after conflict ends and they'll have the resources to do so. That's still the ideal case, but unfortunately, it's the minority of cases that we see in the data. So to get to the first puzzling pattern, why do we see return happening during conflict? This isn't because refugees want to return to their home country whilst conflict is ongoing. This does happen in some cases, like we see this in Ukraine at the moment. But by and large, what I see in the empirical data is that there are two factors driving return during conflict. Firstly, refugees are often living in countries that themselves are prone to conflict. So most refugees live in neighboring countries. They're often living in the border regions of countries next to the conflict that they fled. So 67% of refugees live in neighboring countries. 75% of the world's refugees live in low and middle income countries. They're often living in regions that themselves are prone to conflict. So what sometimes happens in the data is that refugees are living in a neighboring country, and then that country itself breaks out into war. And so that war is actually more of a security risk to those refugees. And because they're living on the border of the country that they fled, they then return back to their origin country, even when war is ongoing. The second factor that I see drive return is forced return policies. So this is the case of Afghanistan that I outlined in that first slide, where host governments are circumventing their obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention, and they're engaging in these non-refoulement policy or refoulement policies where they're forcing refugees to return, doing things like revoking their permits, closing schools, cutting food aid. So refugees are kind of put into a bind and forced to return. So this is why we often see return happening during conflict. It's not because refugees want to return, but instead they're pushed to return. So why do we then, to get to the second question, why is there not return after peace that we might expect? Well, if you can imagine, a lot of conflicts that refugees are fleeing happen over decades. And so refugees in this context have built their lives over decades in asylum. They often have businesses, they have families, they have children that have never been home. It's often very difficult for them to think about picking up their life and putting it back in their home country, even when conflict has ended and there's peace in their home country. In addition to this, asylum countries are typically wealthier than origin countries. So if you imagine a region if you imagine a particular region where refugees are fleeing countries in conflict and then moving to countries, neighboring countries that are maybe a bit safer, these neighboring countries are often wealthier. So economic opportunity is often better in these countries. And so it makes sense that even when there's peace at home, refugees who have built their lives in asylum might not want to return, both because the opportunities they have in the asylum country are greater and because the transition costs of doing so are pretty high. So this leads to four hypotheses. Firstly, that return will increase with a host country push. So this is when there's a forced return policy or war in the asylum country. Second, that return will decrease when quality of life in asylum is high, so when there's more economic opportunity in asylum. Return will increase with origin country security, but maybe less than we would expect. So this is the typical conventional narrative. Fourth, that return will decrease as transition costs increase. So as it's more costly to move, which is when it could be that refugees are more integrated into their asylum country, they've been living there for longer. And also that return will increase with repatriation assistance. So this is when UNHCR provides funds that make it less costly for people to move back. So these four hypotheses map on to this 2x2, where we can imagine conflict ending, yes or no, and there being a host country push, yes or no, and what we're likely to see under these four different conditions. Return is most likely when conflict has ended in the origin country and there's a host country push. But this bottom left-hand quadrant is where I depart from most studies that already exist on refugee return, where conflict might not have ended in the origin country, but because there's a host country push, we still see return. The top right-hand quadrant looks at when conflict has ended, so there's peace in the origin country, there's no host country push. The factors that then will determine whether refugees return are these quality of life and transition costs factors. So my empirical strategy. So I first want to outline the data set. So I started this project using the UN data that exists on refugee return. So the UN already has a data set looking at refugee return. And so I was trying to map this onto these archival materials that I was reading about specific cases. And what I was finding was that the UNHCR data just didn't match up to this archival material. I was reading about some of the major cases that we see of refugee return. The UNHCR data was often missing tens of thousands of refugees returning, or they were saying that refugees returned in years that the qualitative cases suggested they didn't return in. And so what this said to me is that I needed to build another data set where I was trying to use this qualitative data to hand code another data set looking at refugee return. So what are some of the issues that I saw with the UNHCR data? Firstly, it records only voluntary repatriation often, so it doesn't record forced return. It says this in the way that it outlines its data set. It often misses spontaneous returns. So these are returns where refugees haven't formally returned using UN support. Instead, they've just kind of gone back over borders. It often omits unregistered populations. These are populations that aren't officially refugees, they're not formally refugees, so they're not in the UNHCR refugee statistics. The stock figures are often planning estimates, so they're kind of negotiated between the asylum country government and UNHCR, but they're not really what experts on the ground think of as the number of refugees in the context. And then there are political reasons to misrepresent. So often, asylum countries will suggest, will say that they have more refugees in their country so that they can get more refugee aid. And UN goes along with these statistics because it wants to stay in the country providing support for people. And if they go against the asylum country, they will then often they won't have access to these populations anymore. So these are some of the patterns that I see in the UN data that explain some of the errors that I was noticing when I first embarked on this project. So the global refugee returns data set, what do I do to try to think about, to improve on some of these issues? So what I do is I I use two qualitative data sources and hand code those data sources to look at correct stock and returns data, and then a whole set of measures that will help us to understand what's driving these patterns. So I use the World Refugee Survey and the US State Department Human Rights Reports. Across these two sets of years, I hand coded the top 25 cases. And I will say a big thank you to the Political Violence Lab, where I worked with 39 research assistants who helped me to code the rest of these, and I checked every one of them. With this data, I coded new measures of forced return policies and camp settlement. And then I also code up additional measures of funding, which is from a separate set of archival material that I collected from the UN archives in Geneva in 2022. So I have new data on funding per refugee and also repatriation funding in particular. So my empirical strategy, I'm predominantly looking at within dyad variation. So I use a PPML, a Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood estimator with fixed effects, with two-way fixed effects. So the sample in the data, I filtered the data set to look at only cases where there are more than 1,000 refugees in that dyad year in the previous year. The standard areas are clustered by dyad, and the coefficients describe return rates. So looking at like percentage of those who returned in the previous year rather than absolute return counts. The covariates include conflict in the country of asylum, forced return policies for the asylum hypothesis 2, the GDP ratio, for origin conditions, also conflict in the country of origin, transition costs. I proxy for this in a few ways. I look at whether refugees are integrated in urban areas versus in camps. So if you can imagine, the transition costs will be higher if refugees are already integrated into urban areas compared to living in camps, where they're often more likely to be dependent on aid. I also look at conflict duration, so the amount of time that refugees have lived in asylum. This is a proxy for that. And then repatriation funding. So this is to get at whether the UN can provide funding that reduces the transition costs. And then I include a couple of controls here, looking at the rights that refugees have and whether the ethnic group of refugees is excluded from power in the origin country. And then I include a lot more variables in the robustness checks, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. So what do I find? Here I've put up the two main models from my results. The model on the left includes the controls that I just outlined. It doesn't include repatriation funding because I only have that data for a smaller subset. The second model does include repatriation funding, but it doesn't include the controls, so it's a smaller subset. What I find is that the really important factors driving return are these pushes in the country of asylum that I outlined in my theory. So what we see is that it's these severe forced return policies and host country conflict that drive return. We also see that asylum quality of life reduces return, so that a one standard deviation increase in the GDP ratio leads to about an 80% reduction in return. So these kind of economic opportunity factors across the asylum country and the origin country really matter. The origin country conditions in terms of conflict, they're signed as expected generally, but they're not significant in this main specification. I do see in some of my alternative robustness checks using different ways of measuring conflict in the origin country, like using battle deaths or using another data set looking only at civil wars. this is significant. So I'm kind of considering whether to change this main specification. But throughout all of the robustness checks, I find that it's still these pushes in the asylum country that remain the most substantively significant factors driving return, rather than these origin country conflict factors. In terms of transition costs, we see that whether refugees are living in an urban area or a camp does also determine whether they return or not. Conflict duration isn't particularly significant, it's only weakly significant, but repatriation funding does seem to have an effect. So when there's an increase in repatriation funding, refugees are more likely to go back. So this suggests that when UN is able to provide people with more funding to return, they are more likely to return. I then also present predicted return rates. So going back to that 2x2 that I outlined earlier on in my theory section, when we think about there being a push factor present and conflict ending in the origin country, what then happens to the predicted rates of return? And what we see in the in this analysis maps onto the theory, so that rates of return are lowest when conflict is ongoing in the origin country and there's no push factor. When there is no push factor but conflict ends in the origin country, so there's peace, we do see a slight increase in return. But what seems to be the major factor, again, increasing return rates, is these host country push factors. So here, the circle is host country conflict, so when there's war in the asylum country, and the triangle is a forced repatriation policy. So it's under these two conditions that we see refugees more likely to return, even when there's conflict ongoing in the origin country. Now, the next slide that I'm going to show is this top right quadrant. So when there's no host country push factor and conflict ends, so when there's peace, what then predicts return? And what I've shown here is looking at the economic conditions in the two countries, so the host country and the origin country, and whether refugees are living in an urban area or a camp to proxy for transition costs. And what we see is that the highest rates of return are likely to be when the origin country is richer. So this is when the home country that refugees have fled has better economic opportunity, and refugees are living in a camp, so they're less integrated, the transition costs are lower. We also see high, not particularly high, but higher rates of return when the origin country is richer and refugees are well integrated into urban areas, but generally very low return rates when economic conditions in the asylum country are better than in the origin country. I also then do this counterfactual decomposition where I think about if we set each of these different factors to 0, how much return would there have been over this whole period? As another way of presenting the results. And just one thing to outline here is that even if all origin country wars had ended, we would still have had 324 million refugee years that would have still been spent in asylum over the period of the dataset, the time period of the dataset from 1980 to 2023. So even if all war ended, we would have still seen this very large number of refugees around the world. So this kind of this underscores the argument that these push factors and economic gaps seem to be more dominant in terms of predicting return than origin country conditions. I then have a section in the paper where I talk about descriptively what are the prevalence of these push factors. And I show that push factors are common. So on the left-hand side is a plot, so it's quite small, but it looks at the major refugee origin countries and the rates of push factors, so asylum country conflict in the circles are asylum country conflict, and the stars are forced return policies, and the background is the color maps onto a high or low severity of conflict in the origin country. And what we see is it's very common for there to be war in the asylum country or a forced return policy. So these are pretty common. We also see in the descriptive data that asylum quality of life typically exceeds that of the origin country. So in peace years without push, the origin country is richer in only 10.4% of dyad years, yet those dyads account for 44% of returns. So in 90% of the cases where there's peace and no push factor, the asylum country is richer than the origin country. So it kind of makes sense if people don't want to return because of economic opportunity. And then to get to transition costs, the mean number of years in displacement is 21 years. 57% of refugees live outside of camps, and median repatriation funding when UNHCR does provide funding for this is $270 per returnee. We can imagine that this is a lot of money, and refugees often won't be able to provide that themselves. So the reason why I include this section is to show that kind of a lot of the empirical analysis is looking at within dyad variation, but I wanted to think about, okay, how does that map on to the actual patterns that we see in the world? And so this is kind of responding to that, to think about these push factors are very common and transition costs are often high. So I conduct a series of robustness checks, which I'd be happy to talk more about in the Q&A. And what I find across these robustness checks is that the main findings are stable. So it's these push factors that still dominate return rather than the origin country push factors, the origin country pull factors. I mentioned this earlier, but across some of the alternative conflict measures, we do see that the security in the origin country is statistically significant, but it still doesn't reach the same substantive significance as the push factors. But yeah, happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So to conclude, there are three main takeaways of this paper. So firstly, that most return is driven by push from host states rather than peace at home. In the absence of push factors, it's relative quality of life and transition costs that dominate our origin country conditions in terms of predicting return. And that UNHCR data has measurement error for both forced and spontaneous returns. There are some policy implications of this work. Counting repatriations as a durable solution kind of doesn't make sense when we think about when most returns are occurring. Like most returns are occurring under duress, people are coerced to return. So thinking about this as a durable solution doesn't really align with kind of what we hope a durable solution is, which is improving refugee welfare over the long term. This leads to a set of open questions. So what explains variation in the adoption of these forced return policies? What are the welfare consequences of refugees returning when they're forced to return? And then also something that I don't analyze is pushbacks at the border and deterrence from entry, which often happens in high income countries. I look at only when refugees are returning once they're already in the asylum country. But what I see a lot in archival materials is that high income countries often push people back before they get into the country. So this is also something else to explore. Thank you all for listening. I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback. I think that Andrés said that I should talk about what the kind of plans are for this paper. So at the moment, this is a standalone paper. It will be part of a larger book project called How Refugee Crises End, where I think about historically, since the advent of the international refugee regime, when have we seen refugee crises end? So I think about not only refugee return, but also when refugees have resettled to high income countries, when they have integrated into into asylum countries. And I'm doing also a lot of work, particularly in East Africa, looking at integration policies of refugees. So this will feed into a broader book project, but at the moment, this will be a paper that I will produce separately to that broader book project. Thank you all for listening. I'm really looking forward to the feedback.
Great. Thank you so much, Mae. Now we'll turn it over to our two discussants to give comments for 5 to 7-ish minutes each, and then it'll go back to Mae. While the discussants are speaking, if people in the audience have thoughts or things that you want to ask or comments, you can go ahead and type those into the chat, and then I'll sort of weave those into the discussion for Mae as it sort of makes sense. So we'll turn it over to Perisa first, and then we'll go to Idean.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think this is really a fascinating paper, and I enjoyed reading it a lot. And I want to start with the contribution because I think it is a very big one. So you take something that many of us almost take for granted, right? Refugees flee conflict, they stay in asylum, and then they return when the peace comes, right? But you show that this is actually often wrong, or simply the simplification of what is going on in reality. But rather what happens is that like a lot of return happens during conflict, and like when peace comes, many refugees actually do not return. And I think that matters a lot. Like it has like huge implications because, as you said, it is like refugee repatriation is treated as durable solution by the international community. But if return is actually often produced by pressure in asylum, then it means that return may not mean resolution, right? It may mean actually coercion. It may mean secondary displacement, or simply that like asylum has become impossible today. And I also really appreciate the data contribution. I also worked on forced repatriation in my dissertation, so I have thought about this problem a lot before, and I know how hard it is to use the existing data. It is very much hard to separate voluntary return, forced return, spontaneous return, or stop corrections. So I can see how much work went into the global refugee return data set. And regarding the theory, I also very much like the theory. You show us that like refugees do not only ask whether their home is peaceful, but they also ask what life looks like in asylum, what they would lose by moving again, right? And whether they are being pushed out. So I also find the case studies like very useful. They make the mechanisms like very clear, and I think they are very well written as well. So I think it is a excellent paper overall. I think it is like already very promising, but I also think like there are a couple of points which could make the paper even stronger. And I have three main points, and they are either methodological or conceptual. And the biggest point of mine is actually about the measurement of forced return, because the variable is actually doing a lot of work in the paper, right? So it is one of the main contributions of the paper. And my concern is not only about the measurement error, but I think there is an like endogeneity problem built into the coding. So like there are several layers of this endogeneity problem, I think. So the first issue is the coding rule, I would say. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but in the appendix, you discuss that you define severe forced return as policies resulting in the coercive return of large number of refugees. And that kind of puts the outcome partly inside the independent variable, because like to code a case as severe, the coder has to know that like large numbers of refugees have actually returned, and this applies to moderate forced return policies as well. So moderate forced return has a related issue, right? Because it refers to, I think, the policies affecting less than 10% of the refugee population. So again, the scale of the movement enters the policy measure here. And I'm thinking like a cleaner approach would be to separate the policy from the results. For example, we may look into the questions such as like, did the host state issue a deportation order, or did it revoke permits, close camps, cut food aids, or arrest people without documents, for example? Or did the host government announce a deadline for refugees to leave? So these are policy instruments that I'm like talking about. Like the number of people who returned, I feel like it should be like measured separately. And there are actually two more layers, and the other one is related to reporting attention. So you mainly use the World's Refugee Survey reports, right, as along with the U.S. State Department reports. The thing is, like, they are written after the fact, right? When there is a large refugee return wave, analysts just sit down and like look for causes of return, and then like document the state policies. But in many instances, diets like return diets, like they're actually very quiet, but they may also include like similar kind of pressure, but that kind of like similar pressure may get less attention. So the visibility of coercion may be produced by the return wave itself. And the other issue I was thinking about when I was reading the paper was about like timing, because like host governments, may increase pressure after they already see people leaving. This is like what we observe in reality, or when, for example, origin country conditions make return politically acceptable. Again, host governments push refugees to return. And to address this issue, you actually lack the independent variables, which I think is very helpful. But I still think that like this does not fully solve this because, coercive policies persist across years. And if the last year's coding was shaped by last year's returns, then the lagged variable still carries the problem forward, right? It still includes it still reflects the number of total returns. Another point that I want to raise is like about this is related to source, especially after 2009. So you shift at 2009, you shift from World Refugee Survey to the State Department reports, right? So you rightly point out this in your paper, but I just want to like highlight it as well. Like, country reports may underreport coercion by allies and overreport coercion by adversaries. So we know that like human rights monitoring is biased when it comes to countries. So you check with you use World Refugee Survey data only to check whether your results hold, but it excludes many contemporary cases like Syria, Venezuela, or Ukraine. So I was wondering if it would be possible for you to also check Amnesty International reports or Human Rights Watch reports. I'm not saying that they are like not biased at all, but like we would expect them to be less biased than countries, including the US, I would say. And the other thing related to indigeneity point is like I also want to mention that like the UNHCR data, I think is not a like clean voluntary benchmark either. So like you mentioned in your presentation that like it's in writing in its preamble, it says that it records only voluntary repatriation. But UNHCR has like sometimes we know that like it assisted returns in coercive settings as well. For example, like it assisted in the repatriation of Afghan refugees from Pakistan to Afghanistan in 2016, or the example that you gave us in the beginning of the presentation, the Afghan refugees repatriation from Iran and Pakistan in 1990s, for example, it is included in the UNHCR data, even though they were examples of forced returns, which I would definitely agree because like, or also, for example, it also includes data on Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh to Myanmar in more recent times in 2017, if I'm not wrong. They were both these were both instances where return happened during high intensity conflict, right? So I think why UNHCR says that is that like, and I think like UNHCR also sometimes like acknowledges its involvement in coerced returns, and but like in defending those actions, it argues that like they strive to end the coercive conditions, but sometimes their efforts simply prove ineffective. And in such scenarios, they view assisting repatriation is better than doing nothing because like providing support for only voluntary return could actually mean leaving refugees with no choice but to remain in detention or much worse conditions. So what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, like even if the UNHCR says that in writing, like I'm aware that it also includes its data includes some of forced returns. So this creates an like endogeneity problem as well. So this was my main point, but I have like more minor points. So the other the other points that I want to raise is one of them is about the word push. Um, so I was thinking about how to differentiate states' unwillingness to host refugees and inability to host refugees. So you treat forced return policies and conflict in the asylum country as push factors, right? And both make staying harder for refugees. So they are politically and I would also say like morally different. So I'm like thinking about how to empirically differentiate the unwillingness and inability to host, like whether we can put one of them on like under just one heading. So like when we talk about forced repatriation, we're like usually talking about like unwillingness to host. The states wants refugees out, and for that reason, it uses law, policing, permits, camp closures, aid cuts, threats, conflict in the asylum country is often more about like inability to host, like the state may not be simply able to protect people. But there may be also other factors other than conflict, which makes the host states unable to host due to low capacity. So I think that distinction matters, and because like one mechanism is closer to violation of non-refoulement, but the other is like closer to a collapse of protection, if you will. And actually, you do this, like the formal model partly separates coercive policy from the general insecurity, right? But the narrative, the overall narrative in the paper sometimes like put them together, and that's just my thought, but I think I would keep them a little bit like more separate. And one way to do is that to ask whether the harm is intentionally targeted at refugees and whether a state agency was involved or not. Right. So, and I have one last comment, which is about the quality of life. Quality of life. So this is also an essential part of the paper, and I find this mechanism very, very compelling. But I wondered whether it would be possible to be like more precise about what it means. So so you use GDP ratio, urban settlement, refugee rights, camp residence, and funding. And I think these are absolutely very useful proxies. But quality of life can mean other things as well, right? So it can mean, for example, jobs, legal status, or qualitative studies also suggest that schooling for children is very much important. Kin networks are very much important, or hope for citizenship, like at some point, like gaining citizenship. And so I was trying to think about like how to look at the different effects of different aspects of like quality of life. So GDP is, I think, very useful, but refugee welfare can be very different from national income. That's so because like we know examples where a richer host country can be legally much more hostile than a poorer country towards refugees. Like poorer host countries sometimes offer land, ethnic ties, or everyday security. So in certain settings, like the quality of life could be better in countries where they have
About one
higher.
more minute, please.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, let me wrap up. So regarding the urban settlement, it can like we treat this as meaning integration and higher transition costs, but it can also mean like informal work, police harassment, and less aid, for example. Camps can be terrible, they mostly are, but like what I'm trying to say is that I think I would encourage the paper to separate the economic, legal, and social quality of life, even if the data cannot measure all three perfectly. Maybe I thought theory can say which one matters the most in refugees' decision making and for what kind of return that would make. Like that may be the outside of the um, scope of study, but I thought that that's an interesting thing to look at. So yeah, I'll stop here. I think this is an excellent paper. I very much enjoyed reading it, and I think this asks a much better question. Like it changes the question from like when do refugees go home to who produces return and under what degree of choice, right? I think it is a more realistic and more relevant and timely question, and I think this is why the paper is very, very important. Thank you so much for working on that. It is super important. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Perisa. Now we'll turn it over to Idean.
All right. Thanks for this wonderful paper, Mae. This was a pleasure to read. Well written. I think you're making a strong theoretical contribution and a strong correction in the literature, and also providing some important data. So I commend you for that, and I'd like to see where this paper goes. I have one minor point, and then sort of 5 more substantive points. Minor is you need to engage with Michael Barnett's work on this topic. I didn't see him cited, but he, was one of the pioneers of looking at refugee return. He looks at how the UNHCR has been involved in this process, and sometimes violating the Refugee Convention. So that work, I think, is really foundational in this field, and it needs to be there, front and center. Okay, so 3 sort of theoretical points. First, on the conceptualization of what we mean by forced return. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this. So if we have a situation where the origin country conflict has ended, conditions are safe, there's minimal risk of violence, the UNHCR has said that it's safe to return, and refugees are not returning home. At that point, is it legitimate for the country of asylum to end refugee status, revoke work visas, encourage them to return home, or is that forced? Right. I think that's important to grapple with, right? So you're establishing that people are remaining even beyond the end of the conflict, and that's for economic reasons. So I think many host countries would say, look, this protection was always temporary, was always designed to be temporary. We're going to, assuming they're doing the right thing always, and I'm not going to make that assumption, but you can see cases where conditions have changed back in the home country. We're confident that you can return home safely, so we're going to incentivize you to leave through positive or negative inducements. I would reserve the word forced for coerced return to unsafe conditions. And sort of use another terminology for sort of encouraging return after the conflict has ended. So that's in your 2x2 graph, the case where conflict has ended and then the host country is encouraging people to go back. I wouldn't put that in the forced category. I'd just be careful about terminology there. Okay, second, the sort of if this goes to a migration scholar, rather than a conflict scholar, they're going to push you a little bit on this here versus there dichotomy. Even during refugee crises, we do see a lot of circular migration, which is sort of hard to pick up in data. We want to know that do you live here or do you live there? In reality, we know from a number of surveys, we know from UNHCR records that people do go back and forth to check on property, to check on loved ones, and they do sort of they live in this sort of flux space of circular migration, which is very, very hard to pick up in data, right? We know even during the height of the Syrian civil war, people were going back from Turkey to check on their farms and their households, and then returning back to Turkey and so on, right? So I think I would just be careful about that. Okay, my third point on the theory, I think this is a bigger point. You sort of have an individual utility function, and you sort of formalize this. How would the theory change if rather than an individualist assumption, we assume that these decisions are made in households and communities? That the refugee community or the household in which the individual is embedded in is responsible for this decision making. So this can play out in a couple of ways. One is chain migration, right? Is once a critical threshold of people have returned home, those are the first movers to return, and they've determined that conditions are safe. They've communicated back to family and friends in the refugee camp or wherever they're residing that, look, we went back, it's okay. Then we start to see a snowballing of migration, sort of a threshold model, sort of a Granovetter style tipping point model that once a critical mass of people have returned, it's easier for the next person to go back. So we should see clumpiness in the data if we have sort of community level decisions to migrate. The other way that this household uh, um, return could play out is, and we see this in sort of migration, economic migration, is that you send some people back and some people remain within the same household. So if it's a wealth thing, you might have a few people stay in the country of asylum to work, and they send remittances back to rebuild the home that was lost or damaged or destroyed. So you have a sort of a partial migration within the household to sort of to ease the transition process. Okay, so a couple more data points here now that we're sort of beyond theory. I sort of agree with Perisa here. I think it's very ambitious to be collecting this return data. I've worked with the World Refugee Survey myself. I know that in the 1980s, it was a tiny pamphlet with like one staple in it. Then later it becomes this glossy thing. And then in the late 2000s, it sort of dies out. I know some background behind that as well. But the data are not, I think you're putting a little bit too much faith in the exact point estimate. The data are noisy. Um, we don't know with precise certainty, either using UNHCR or using World Refugee Survey or the State Department. We don't know the precise number. We can give sort of ordinal counts, low, medium, high. But if we're sort of really interested in precise point estimates, there's too much noise in the data to really be able to do that. We have some good cases where we have, good corroborating evidence and multiple data sources point us in the same direction. In other cases, the data, especially as we go back further in time, the data are very spotty and we have a sort of a general magnitude of return, but trying to get a precise point estimate is much, much more difficult. So I'd be a little bit more circumspect about that. There may be an entire data article that you produce on validating the data and the sources and comparing them against each other. Um, there's some other things that I would also want to validate, like your data versus the DW wrap. How does de jure versus de facto policy compare? Ethnicity of refugees, you have that in there, although it wasn't quite clear how you piece that together. That might be the Bonet and Ruger data, although that doesn't cover your entire time period. So I think I would just be um, maybe in an appendix, sort of talking about how the data were collected and its value. And then the final thing, I think there should be for many of the variables interactions with time. How long have the refugees been there? How long has the crisis lasted? As you correctly point out, as people build new lives in the country of asylum, they're less likely to return, but that should also be a function of time. So maybe the GDP ratio interacted with the duration of the refugee crisis. Obviously, you don't have individual data, but you have, let's say, the Bangladesh 1971 crisis. Many, many people flew to a wealthier country, but then they returned right away because the conflict lasted a few months. In other cases, like Syrians in Turkey, now they've been there for over a decade. So they've sort of built lives there. So an interaction with time, I think, would be important and interesting to see what the results are. But in all, brilliant paper. Loved reading this. I think it's well on its way to publication, and I'd like to see where it goes next. So thank you.
Great. Thank you to both Parisa and Idean. May, if you want to conclude with sort of what are your thank yous and your two or three sort of main takeaways from what the discussants have said, or to give us sort of some context for the paper writ large and the discussion, and then we'll sort of conclude from there.
Yeah, a huge thank you to you both. These comments have been incredibly helpful. I've been typing away furiously. So I think both in terms of the like deep reading on the empirics and like really interrogating what those variables are doing, and then also thinking about the substantive implications of the theory, like all of these points are well received. And I'm really grateful for you reading this paper and giving these thoughts. I could respond to each of the comments. I won't do that because I know that we don't have that much time. I take the Michael Barnett. Actually, Michael Barnett's work was like pretty foundational when I was starting out with this work back in first and second year of grad school. So you're right to point out that I haven't spoken enough about that, so I will do so. And one point that I think I wanted to make just on Parisa's first point about the endogeneity of these forced return policies. So I don't include the there can be a case where something is marked as a forced return policy without refugees having returned. So the coding of the coding of the variable is more like the kind of alternative that you suggested, which is based on are they returning because of forced return, forced cutting of aid? Oh, sorry, it's not conditional on them returning. Is there a forced aid? Is there a cutting of aid policy? Is there a like revoking of permits policy? The kind of magnitude only matters where people are returning, but it's only like a few people returning, in which case we don't want to think about that as like a large scale forced return policy. But I see why that could complicate things because it does lead to some endogeneity. But for the large part, it's mostly around whether it's a policy or just a threat of a policy. But all of these comments are really well taken. I think that the thought about including like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch reports is a really good one, and I could definitely like validate the data with those. So I will go back and do that. I think that Idean, your point about how do we conceptualize forced return is a really difficult normative question, and it's something I've also been grappling with. Also in the context where I do fieldwork in East Africa, it is technically safe for refugees to return to South Sudan. There's no war there. The war ended in 2018, but people are still terrified that war will break out again. So it does raise these really thorny questions of if people are returning now because aid has been cut, which we've seen with these USAID cuts, does that mean they're being forced to return? Or not, because actually the conditions are peaceful, technically. So I think this does raise some really thorny normative questions, which I don't know if I can answer, but I think that the point you raise is I should just be very careful about the way that I conceptualize this idea of forced return. I'll think about that for the paper. So yeah, thank you both so much for these comments. This has been incredibly helpful. This is the first time I presented this paper, so it's really good to get this feedback. And if any of the other audience members had any questions or thoughts, I can put my email in the chat. I'd love to hear any more feedback on the paper.
Just a quick
And
thing on the Human Rights Watch. So there's a
yeah,
story here. So Bill Freelick was the lead on the World Refugee Survey in the 2000s. He left U.S. Committee on Refugees and Immigrants and moved to Human Rights Watch, and then you start to see forced migration in the Human Rights Watch report. So it was one
oh
person that
wow.
moved from one institution to another, and Human Rights Watch now includes the forced migration component in it because of that job change.
What was his name?
His name is Bill Freelick. You can see if you look at the World
Oh,
Refugee Reports in the late
yeah.
90s and early 2000s, he's the lead editor of it. And then
Oh,
he left
fascinating.
in the World Refugee Survey ends because he leaves for Human Rights Watch.
Okay, I had been wondering why it ended because it's such an amazing resource, but now this makes sense. I thought it was like budget cuts or something, but this makes sense. So great, I'll go to those Human Rights Watch reports. It's great that you have that information. Yeah, thank you both so much for these comments, and thank you, Andres and Mason, for organizing this. It's been really great.
Yeah, great. Thank you all. Awesome discussion. Thank you, May, for the presentation. I thought this paper was really great. And much thanks to Perisa and Idean for offering feedback and thoughts and carefully reading the paper. Thanks to all in the audience watching live or at some point in the future for supporting the Peace Science Colloquium. We hope to see you all at the Peace Science meeting in November. Thank you.